K-pop Demon Hunters, Haja Boy's breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
Right now at the Home Depot, shop Spring Black Friday savings and get up to 40% off, plus up to $500 off select appliances from top brands like Samsung. Get a fridge with 0 clearance hinges, so the doors open fully even in tighter spaces in your kitchen. And laundry that saves you time, like an all-in-one washer-dryer that can run a full load in just 68 minutes. Shop Spring Black Friday savings, plus get free delivery on appliance purchases of $998 or more at the Home Depot. Offer valid April 9th through April 29th, U.S. only. See store online for details.
Pepsi Prebiotic Cola in original and cherry vanilla. That Pepsi taste you love with no artificial sweeteners and 3 grams of prebiotic fiber. Pepsi Prebiotic Cola. Unbelievably Pepsi.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. When Sarah Jean Grimm grabs up the language with which to build a poem in her most recent chapbook, Hog Lagoon, she comes at it with a sledgehammer in hand. Cliché, common and natural phrasing, are broken in half to make way for the new to emerge on the page where, quote, the cash cow has failed to lactate forever. And a feeling of contrition is sharper than a kernel lodged in the gum line. In a collection that cruises along the blurred line between domestic and work life, with stops at the mall, the internet, the deep well of pop culture, not to mention homes and workplaces, it is often the natural world that intrudes with a tusk or a stale bit of bread on the logic of consumerism. Into the flaccid resolutions of the speaker's life in the poem Mall Baby, Sarah Jean inserts the red tail of the hawk and the squirrel dragging around his body weight in baguette. In other poems, there is a bald eagle, tie-dye, and a zoo at night. And with each entrance into the scene of a natural image, the reader comes to realize that Sarah Jean is demanding space in the most restrictive corners of late capitalism. Into those spaces, she plants the question, upon whose backs does the onus to care reside? And is care possible when solidarity is replaced with the narcissistic gaze that modern life offers such easy access to? A master of contradiction and oxymoron, Sarah Jean works her poetry into tightly woven ropes of affection and disgust, care and violence, agency and immobility, and always with a nod to the nature of desire in an extractive culture. The poems of Hog Lagoon feel imminent and immediate, even as they linger like a note struck just right. Sarah Jean Grimm is the author of Soft Focus and the chapbook Hog Lagoon. She was a founding editor of Powder Keg magazine and currently edits the small poetry press After Hours Editions. She lives in upstate New York and works as a book publicist with Broadside PR. Welcome to Burned by Books, Sarah Jean Grimm.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Sarah Jean, I knew you first via your work in PR, and then later as the wonderful poet that I got to be immersed with and in your poetry in Hog Lagoon and other places online. But you have a really unique vantage to the place of poetry in the national discourse today, working as a poet, but then also working with poets, contemporary poets. And you started your own poetry journal. So you have what I would say is probably one of the best vantages for thinking about poetry in our present moment. And I wonder where you think we are as a nation of poets and where poetry lives today in our literary universe.
Oh gosh, that's a great question, and it's a big question, and I appreciate the ways in which you have named that I'm suited to answer it. But
And I realize that it's an unfair question too, because it's too big, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
No, thank you. And I'm also I'm not in academia. Like there are whole worlds and ecosystems of poetry that I am not attuned to. And maybe it's fair to say that like being as immersed in the publishing side of things as I am gives me a little bit more of a cynical perspective than is possibly fair to the state of poetry in the world and in the US right now. I mean, I think that people are always going to be hungry for poetry. I think that it will always have an important place in society, even though sort of the running joke is like, only poets read poetry. That's obviously not true. The fact that we all can appreciate a good pop song means that we all can appreciate poetry. Sometimes I think that the way that it's taught and the way that it's sort of siloed in literary discourse lends it this inaccessibility, like this sheen of erudition, where a poem is something to be unlocked, and if you don't have the right toolkit, then this poem is not for you. And I don't think that's true at all. I think anyone can appreciate a poem. Maybe you haven't found the right sort of gateway poet for you, but what speaks to me in a poem might not be what speaks to somebody else in a poem. But as far as like what my view on from my publishing perspective has lent, I see the sales numbers for the poetry that After Hours Editions publishes, and we're a very modest press. Like we only aim to sort of make enough money from one book to be able to put out the next book. And we're doing it at our own pace. It's really not like a money-making enterprise. But it's still like a real uphill battle to get attention for poetry. And then I've had the privilege of working with some incredible poets at Broadside PR as well. And I'm really, really proud of the publicity that we've earned for those poets as well. But
I'm excited to talk to D.S. Waldman, who's on
your
catalog.
I'm so glad that you're speaking with Dan. Yeah, he's incredible. And for a debut poet too, like just what a dazzling entry, I think. Like what a splashy entry into the poetry world. It's such a gorgeous book. Yeah, it's just there's a lot more elbow grease that goes into publicizing a poetry collection. And I love that work. Like I find it really gratifying and important, if I could say that. But it is a lot harder to get people to pay attention to poetry because I think there's a way in which like people just sort of exclude themselves from poetry. Like they maybe, they don't feel like it's for them.
That's very true. I think they're told that story that you're telling, that it requires a certain set of keys that only the very erudite or the very poetic have at their disposal. But what I found, as I was reading your collection, is what I love about poetry is its immanence. The fact that you feel it and live in it in an instant, rather than decoding it. It's in the way that it refuses normalized forms of language. You just completely take it in, like into your DNA, I feel like.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's immediate. It's language itself. It's like distilled to its purest form. And you can enjoy it on that level. You can just enjoy it sonically. It can be very fun to decode a poem as well and spend, lots and lots of time over one sitting with it, or to revisit a poem over a decade and see how your response to it changes or what else you might get out of it. Like that's definitely a pleasure that's available to you if you're reading poetry, but it doesn't have to be this sort of mystery to unlock.
Yeah. I want to jump to your chapbook, Hog Lagoon, and start by having you read the title poem, if you wouldn't mind. It happens to be my favorite in the collection, and I think it will be a particular kind of key to unlock your form and style.
Thank you. Hog Lagoon. I knew a beautiful woman with the bruisiest ego. Like a foamy sunset, it undazzled. Vanity works like a dental pick, sharp at both ends. I don't pretend to roll the windows down in a Cadillac of hypocrisy and look out on some moral vista. No, I twirl my mercy like a baton and build suspense in the billowing. My heart can be so mutton. Mostly I observe the world with great affection. Otherwise, it's disgust. If the field of my vision lands on something pitiful, I feel as grotesque as a diapered bear balancing on a ball. And also there is jeering, the universal sound of wanting something to fail. The sound my heart spontaneously makes when I consider bail bondsmen, oil tycoons, elephant poachers. I get sick with the simultaneity of knowing we're all in the mire together, inundated and overtopped. Maybe the squeaky soul gets the grace, a doomy souvenir. I never thought we would lie on velvet poofs, unjealous and braiding each other's hair, but I did hope there would be snacks.
Thank you so much. I love that last line. I feel like it's actually quite indicative of your style overall. And I also have to just point out the image of the grotesquerie of the diapered bear. And I wondered where that came from, if that was like some version of the sort of like medieval trick bear, or is that just pure Sarah Jean imagination?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. It's sort of drawing on that iconography, and maybe I sort of picked up on it from the like twirling baton or something. There's a little bit of like a bravado in this poem that isn't me, but I think I had fun playing with that. And I think the diapered bear also connects to the title, which is, a hog lagoon is essentially like a storage basin for pig waste and in factory farming.
I had shithole in my notes.
Yeah, exactly. That's That's the plain version, yeah. And it's this like really beautiful combination of words together. Actually, it's so funny. I did like a little launch reading for this chapbook at a lovely bar near my town, and the bar owner had this like pennant made up that said Hog Lagoon, and she told me about it after the fact and how it was hanging in her room, and she just thought the words were so pretty together, and I was like, oh. Hog Lagoon is this other thing, and she had no idea, and I felt so bad to like ruin her decoration. But yeah, it's like it's kind of a lovely combination of words, and it Hog Lagoon itself, we have these like satellite images of them, and they have this gorgeous like pink purple hue, which is the color of this chapbook as well. But they, that color comes from like the bacteria, and they're also like a huge problem for the environment. And so yeah, there's something really grotesque, I think, just embedded in the poem from the start.
Yeah, it's I was having dinner with the poet Aishan Hutchinson recently, and he saw your book and he said, "That's a hell of a title." And
Thank you.
And he didn't know what a hog lagoon was, and neither did I. So we sat there and we looked it up, and we were struck by the beauty of at a distance. What it looked like, and then up close, the grotesqueness, the filth, the environmental degradation. And
totally.
I think you do that a lot. You're sort of bringing in, like, one of your lines is like garbage that is glittering or shimmering, and you're very interested in that kind of doubling. So what is it about the kind of coin that has both something that glitters and is beautifully aesthetically, and on the other side is grotesque and terrifying?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my poems are just kind of playing at this intersection of capitalism and kind of like moral decrepitude and especially of the environmental kind. And a lot of the poems in this chapbook especially are really interested in like the nature of desire within the context of these extractive systems. And like a lot of the things that we desire can be beautiful and can be shimmering, and a lot of the methods of extraction themselves can be sort of beautiful in a way, or, interesting. I think worthy of attention anyway. And then there's this sort of like spectacle of our, human culpability and complacency against the backdrop of the beauty of nature. And I think like the way that those two things sort of jockey for attention can be really interesting, and that there's a lot of room to play with language in that space.
Yeah. But I do agree with the bartender. Like the words Hog Lagoon do something to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're pretty amazing. And I think you give me an opening to think for a second about what I think is one of the big sort of umbrella questions of all the poems here is, can we think outside the confines of consumerism and late capitalism, which might include something like the Hog Lagoon, having to live with it, but can we think outside it? In the poem Mall Baby, for example, you quote David Byrne saying, shopping is a feeling. Mm-hmm. And then the narrative voice says, I'm returned to the mall of my mind. And then in Toilet Water, we hear that there is nothing that can't be bottled and sold. But within Mall Baby, there is a counter form of thinking. When I'm in nature, you write, I think natural thoughts. Do you see your poems as attempting to engage other forms of thinking, like natural thinking, that might operate as counters to that hegemonic capitalist form of thinking?
I think so, but I think, I think that's where the poem wants to be. Like there's that Rilke line, on the other side of nature. Like I think that's where my poems want to be, but that's not where I live. And so they're kind of wrestling with that. And I think, if there's an attempt to sort of, maybe they fail at the attempt, but like the attempt is worth the effort. Like sometimes I think it's a whiff,
I like that.
But I think that can be a fun thing to write through, and hopefully that can be kind of a fun thing to read as well, because I think it's a strange contradiction that we're all living through in this time, this really precarious moment in so many ways.
Yeah, I'm going to come back around to you and contradictions, because you really like them, and oxymorons, and it's some of the most fun things about your poems. But I wanted to start with a question about how engaging and surprising your voice is as a poet. And I think some of that surprise after several readings, I believe, comes from your restraint. Adjectives are actually rare enough in your phrasing that when they show up, they really hit. For example, in the poem Sex Machina, which wins for best title.
Thank you.
I just love that. The lead up to an adjective begins with the lines, nature produced automata. Opening an email from an unknown sender, the message says, I am not a spammer, I exist. I experience a digital flattening. Digital flattening makes everything that came before it sort of vibrate with new meaning. And later we'll get scummy koi ponds and neutered intuition and bodacious oak. And so those adjectives are fewer than we might imagine in a typical poem, and it is your restraint that makes them mean, I think. And I wanted to know what your relationship is to adjectives in your work, and how you decide when to use them and when to withhold.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something I hadn't really considered. So I wonder how much I'm doing that, unconsciously. But I do gravitate to nouns. I think like a chunky noun, or that can be really, it's something to grab onto, and often I'll use a noun in place of an adjective, like in Hog Lagoon when I said my heart can be so mutton. I mean, mutton isn't really, it's not really a descriptor, but it's kind of another way of saying tender, and so I think my first stop along the way is a noun. And to kind of put them in unexpected forms brings me a lot of pleasure as a writer. But yeah, I mean, bodacious is like a really fun word. I was happy to fit that into a poem, but it also just made sense. Like it was Yeah, I don't know that I'm intentionally holding back adjectives, but I'm going to think about that more as I edit my manuscript and as I continue to write.
Well,
Yeah, it's a
I
great
think
question.
well, I think you sort of gave away your hand when you say how much you
Hmm,
like a chunky noun. So maybe it's less
right.
withholding and more that you want nouns to do a lot of the work.
Yeah, I
And they
think that's right.
definitely do. And then and I noted, I have marginalia that says, "Oh, she's eschewing adjectives and letting two nouns do that work."
Right.
Um, and I think I grafted myself into this question because I once had a poetry workshop with Paul Muldoon in
Mhm.
which he said that I needed to stop using adjectives because I sounded like a Hallmark card. So I feel like that I am then attuned to the ways in which
Sure.
writers show restraint,
But see,
and
that's where people are, shy of poetry, is that no one wants to sound like a Hallmark card, but there's a place for the Hallmark card.
I didn't want to be in that place though.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're so right.
I just heard a new rule to avoid the word "but" in poems, and I never
Mm.
heard that, and now I'm like, I have to comb back through all my work and see where I say "but." I feel like I rely on that a lot.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, there are all these kinds of rules of thumb that they're there to be broken too, right?
The
To be played with.
the no buts rule isn't going to work for all my students who want to write heated rivalry poems, though, because it's
That's so
so.
funny.
Your work in Hog Lagoon and elsewhere invests forms of care and caring with an attention to the language that we use around those things, even when care comes paired with cruelty. I wonder if you'd read the poem House Wine for us, and then we can
Sure.
talk a little bit about how you address the double-sided nature of care.
House wine. I throw my body around the room, attempting to sweat out a decade of harm I'll keep inflicting. Who am I to disrupt a pattern? Predictability is an element of trust. Control is like cruelty. It operates on a gradient. Now my body stands in for a discarded hard drive, and I am allowed to hate anyone who pinches my cheeks as much as I might hate my own routine piety and catered reasoning, elevator chatter about office floor plans. It's futile to perform civility anywhere in this century, like the rictus on a billboard hung where no cars are going, a traffic light blinking over an unpaved road. Contradiction rescues me from the tyranny of choice. It is possible to be full of sex without having any. That's where miracles come from. Any object can become a terrarium if nature is allowed to take over, just as anything can be fermented and consume the tastes of a born consumer. That's how I never fail to notice Churchill Downs on the airwaves. The cold streak wetly by, and I relate to the sloppy track.
I love that poem. There's a narrative of self-care here that's inseparable from cruelty, attempting to sweat out a decade of harm that the speaker will keep inflicting. The final image of our speaker imagining themselves trampled into the muddy track. And that sits in contradiction to the idea of an object becoming a terrarium, fermenting with life. How are care and cruelty two sides of the same poetic coin here?
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of your big questions. You're such a beautiful, close reader. And I think, not to dodge the question at all, and I hope I can answer it,
No,
but
dodge
just
away. Take it where you like.
just as like a first kind of foray into it, I think one of the things that I love about a poem is that it can resist that kind of answer. Like it wants to sort of point to that and then leave room for the reader to fill in the meaning, if that makes sense. And so
Mhm.
just to sort of point to cruelty and care as being on the same spectrum is kind of the work that I think this poem wants to do. But I also think that a lot of the poems in this chapbook and that I've been writing in general lately are kind of grappling with this frustration of like the impotence of care, and the cruelty that we are all just completely surrounded by every day. And I personally feel this real powerlessness to do anything about the systems that I participate in, that I benefit from, that I pay into. And so this question of like, how do I care for myself? How do I care for others? How do I care for the planet? When there's only so much in my control, is a really salient question for me. And I do not have the answer to it, but it's something that my poems, I think, are often circling.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about all the different times in which, one of your poems will sort of come to that loggerheads, like feeling neutered or ineffectual, or all the different ways in which it courses through this collection that so many of us feel impotent to do anything about the cruelty all around us. But like in Mall Baby, I was revolted, but I didn't stop there. And that is both a kind of like continuing on of the thing that's revolting, but it's also I think, a statement that this isn't giving up. It's not a lying down, even though it's easy to feel impotent. Do you feel like your poems are, even though they're very clear-eyed about how little power and agency we seem to have with these systems, that there's another line yet to come?
Yeah, I hope so. I do think my poems are hopeful, and maybe more hopeful than I myself am. Like somehow my speaker can access. I think, the act of creating is itself hopeful. The act of trying to make sense through language is hopeful. To connect with readers is hopeful. I think they point to the possibility of a future that is better than our present, but they're also really aware of how hard it will be to get there, if that makes sense. And then I think they try, they sort of brandish humor sometimes as almost like a defense mechanism or something, or a way through those difficult feelings. Yeah.
Yeah, and we should talk about how funny this collection is, but I was thinking about object permanence and the lines, and poetry isn't dead, it's gone to live on an upstate farm. The world is like that also, getting over its need to be seen. It feels like that there's something embedded there that's important about thinking about possibility and hopefulness, and I liked that very much.
I think that's right. Yeah, thank you.
Let's think about like humor in these poems, because they carry a lot of serious issues and weight, but they're always playing and at times explicitly funny, and then in things like in the poem Toilet Water, the fact that you end with toiling to stay lit, that kind of echo of toilet there just struck me with so much pleasure and amusement. And so you're both explicitly funny, but then I think you also take a lot of amusement and joy from just playing around with language. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how the craft of humor works for you in your poetry.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, thanks for picking up on that. Like, that's one of the joys of writing is putting those little Easter eggs in there. And sometimes it's, I think, just for myself, it's really, really lovely to hear a reader reflect that back. Sometimes humor is explicit. I think, it's one way to kind of move through a poem, these sort of touchstones of a laugh line or something, that often in editing, I need to kind of look at the lines that I think are funny with a little more scrutiny, because it's like, is it a cop out? Do I just want to read this out loud to know that an audience is paying attention and they're with me, or like, does this poem need a laugh? Am I undermining something by putting that in there? But I've also always thought that like poets have a lot in common with stand-up comics. I mean, what stand-up comics do is like by far more challenging and impressive, and I could never, ever, ever do it myself.
It seems like the scariest thing in the world, quite honestly.
It truly does. Like I I would just pass out, I think. But but like the figure of the kind of clown or jester who like uses absurdity to highlight what's real or like to show what's already absurd about reality, I think is like connected to the roots of poetry and like the prophetic roots of poetry. And so yeah, like I don't think humor is misplaced in a poem. I don't mind when a poem isn't funny, but like it is sort of it's an invitation, I think. Like I always appreciate it when a poem does have like a wink in it, I think. And it can even be like a very serious or heartbreaking poem. But essentially, like the first kind of door that I walk through when I'm reading a poem or writing a poem is one of play, like just play with language. And so I think that sort of just naturally gives rise to some level of humor, some level of awareness of what you're doing with the clay of language, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do really enjoy an absurdist kind of twist in Garden and Gun. There's a description of a man who's littering gingerly, I think is the term that you use, and putting a candy wrapper on the back of his truck and then peeling out and watching it sort of like litter itself. But then you say, like a serial killer beta testing his capacity on small animals, which is just, on the one hand, like super funny and then also so disturbing.
Right.
So do you look for those kinds of like absurdities in the world around you and plumb them for poetic possibility?
I think so. I mean, I that was a real act of littering that I witnessed, and I didn't
gingerly littering.
Yeah, just like obviously when you drive away, that wrapper is gonna fly into the air. But you don't want to just put it on the ground yourself because like that would feel too bad or something. I don't know what the thought process was there, but it definitely struck me, and I think that's another one of my favorite things about poetry is just the way that it causes you to pay attention to the world. And so I didn't, whip out my notepad and write that down and start writing the poem that moment, but it was an image that stuck in my brain for a while, and eventually it found its way into a poem. Yeah.
Gender rings like a sonorous bell in the poems of Hog Lagoon. A speaker wishes for a twin sister to, quote, judge more fairly than I do myself. There's a beautiful woman with the bruisiest ego, with vanity working on her like a dental pick, sharp at both ends. The world of Hog Lagoon is one where women are sometimes stamped into a sodden track, consumed by consumerism and critiqued often by themselves. But the revenge in the poem seems to come in the form of a speaker who pulls off the veneer to show the unadulterated truth and to have that stand as its own kind of refusal. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about how gender works in these poems and where you see the speaker doing work to speak back to the things that are considered requirements for women in our moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think my earlier work was even more so concerned with gender and the performative nature of it. And yeah, you hit on the word requirements, which is perfect. And so the book you mentioned when you kindly introduced me, Soft Focus, is much more about this sort of sexual politics. But inevitably that's going to follow me through my work for the rest of my life, probably because I am a cisgendered female in this world. And the requirements are different. And I'm raising a daughter. And so now I'm thinking about these questions in a whole new way, looking to a future that I hope is softer and kinder, but that at the moment it's not looking to be that way at all. So yeah, what my speaker does that I can't do, I think, is she's a little more brazen than I am. She kind of channels, this directness or this talking back, or even just this naming of things that otherwise in my daily life I sort of accept or find a way to live around or live within.
Yeah, I felt the naming to be quite poignant and powerful, and to name it differently, to name it so that you can't look away, and maybe it's as much naming it for yourself as for your reader, since, as you said, it's something that we sometimes need space from in our daily life, and and that naming allows you to kind of give it grounding and anchor it, even if that's a painful anchoring.
Right. Yeah. And I guess the reason I even mention a sort of timeline as far as like how I'm thinking about gender and how that's maybe evolved is that I do feel like those questions weighed a lot more heavily on me when I was younger, and heavily in a different way, I suppose. I mean, in some ways now as a mother, they weigh on me more heavily than ever. But when I was more sort of immersed in the performance of it myself, and in the act of buying the right skincare and all of that, and paying attention to how capitalism was acting on me and all of that, did feel like it's a younger version of myself that was more caught up in that, I think. And now I think, or hope anyway, that I'm more capable of just kind of naming it and like setting it aside, if that, hopefully that rings true in your reading, or that it's, I think the act of naming is sort of enough at this point. The poems aren't like bogged down by it as much, I think.
You used the word Easter eggs before, and I actually had that in a question, because I feel like your poems are littered, gingerly littered with Easter eggs, especially of off rhymes and broken cliches.
Yeah.
And in Sex Machina, for example, we hear the echo of sex everywhere. There's the specter of an X glitters like a sneeze, and I'm here to explode the myth that whipped cream enhances anything, but I support pizza as a pretext for sex. I just love that sort of staccato return to the rhyme there. And then later, learn and uterine rhyme for you, as do erasure and paprika unexpectedly. And we get a front row seat again and again to the ways in which you say, you thought you understood this cliche, but once I, have my way with it, you won't anymore, which I really adore. So you talk a little bit about Easter eggs, how they work here, and what your relationship is to rhyme and cliche.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as I've sort of said, I hope I'm not being redundant, but poetry for me is about play, and the material itself is language. And so however you're making meaning, or whatever you're making meaning about, whatever the poem is trying to say, whether it's even aware that it's trying to say it or not, it's also trying to have fun. And like, rhymes are great fun. They're kind of embedded in us from childhood and nursery rhymes. And sometimes I sort of stumble on them accidentally because it's just how my brain wants to work. I tend to avoid end rhyme, or if I'm going to use it, it's like I know that there's going to be a lot more emphasis on that kind of rhyme, and so like that has to be a really important line. But I love an embedded rhyme. I think it's really fun to, as I said before, like a way to move through a poem, and rhyme is almost another form of humor, I think. Cliches operate the same way. I just read this really great Matthew Olsman poem. I can't remember what the title is, but it's about the cliche of putting the cart before the horse. And he just completely deconstructs it, like by taking it so literally. And it's it's brilliant. Like it's one of those poems that I just wish I wrote, because it's so fun to look at something like that closely and completely dissect it.
Yeah, in part because I think the problem of cliches is that they're totally hollowed out of any meaning.
Right.
But when you give it attention, then all of a sudden it suddenly carries all these meanings that maybe it was never meant to, but do all kinds of fascinating work. Like in Enemy, when you have with resting crisis face by pulling the wool over a new leaf, you've got like a triplicate of cliche there that is, each one of them is doing something to the other cliche. And I like that a lot.
Thanks. Yeah, the whole like engine of that poem was to just kind of try to spill from one cliche into the next and see what new meanings could kind of arise in their friction, I guess.
Yeah, and in the case of that poem, I thought a lot about how, you end the poem writing, of an economy demanding its dues equal bolts, tinsel, and grit. That the cliche and its failed promise, it's the cow that doesn't continue to lactate, to go back to another one of your poems,
right,
but is in many ways the same as the economy's promise. And I thought that was a brilliant way to put those two in conversation.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, Sarah Jean, I would love to know if you've got some things that you've been reading and loving recently and maybe might want to recommend to my listeners.
Yes, I would love to. So you mentioned I'm a publicist. I basically recommend books for a living. So I thought I would set some rules for myself and, not talk about any current books or anything that I'm working on, and just stick to poetry, if that's okay.
I love that.
Okay. So the first book I want to recommend is Nina Polari's Path of Totality. This is a book that is very dear to me. I actually had the honor of editing it with Yuka Igarashi back when I was at Soft Skull Press. So I'm biased in that sense. And also Nina is a dear friend of mine, so doubly biased. But I think it's an extraordinary book. It is about the loss of Nina's daughter, Lumi, during childbirth. The poems are as eviscerating as you would expect, but they are also frequently humorous because they're of this world and baked into its absurdity. They're connected to the natural world. There are a lot of animals kind of populating the poems, and they're very tender and direct. And I just think the whole collection is a marvel. And like, if we could give awards retroactively, I feel like it deserves them all. But please, pick it up. And Nina has a new book coming out next year as well, called Risk Tolerance, that I'm excited to see in the world. So,
and that's Nina Polari, you said?
Nina Polari, yeah, Nina with 2 I's, okay. Polari with 2 L's.
Well, I have to read it, even though it sounds like it's going to utterly destroy me. But
yeah, it's a hard read, and I think people might think it's not for them. She actually has a line, and it's in one of the poems, about how this is a poem for anyone who ever expected anything, and I think that really kind of says it all. Like you don't have to have experienced this kind of loss to be able to relate to it or appreciate it. And the poems, they're very inward looking, but they are incredibly, as I said, like of the world too, and point outwards as well. And so I really do think there's something for everyone to appreciate in it. Yeah. Then this is kind of a cheat, but I wanted to just recommend a press, which is the Song Cave, is one of my favorite poetry presses. You can't go wrong picking up anything they publish. They just put out Emily Skilling's gorgeous new book, Tantrums in Air. And I just started reading one called Shake Until Cloudy by Amanda Nadelberg. I love that title.
Yeah, me too.
And then two of my all-time favorite poets, Jean Gregory and Sarah Nicholson, are both kind of like house authors with the Song Cave. And I think they each have 2 or 3 books with the press. So those are that's like 5 recommendations in one. I'm sorry.
No, I love that. I mean, I feel like these are poets I don't know that I need to seek out.
Yeah. And if I have time for one more,
Yeah, please.
I was recently at a writing residency, which was like such a gift of time because I got to read old books of mine that I knew were favorites, but that I just, hadn't spent time with in a while. And so one of those was Michael Earl Craig's Thin Kimono. And it's a book that will always delight me. And like what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, where, the value of kind of spending time with a poem in one sitting or revisiting it over years and seeing how it changes in you. That's kind of been my experience with this book. And it's one of those that you can like flip to any page and just find a total gem of observation, and something surreal and true is always happening. And Michael Earl Craig is a horseshoer, like he's a farrier in somewhere in the Midwest. I want to say Montana.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so he's just this really interesting guy who happens to be a genius poet, and yeah, a total delight to read and spend time with his brain.
Well, these are amazing, and it's going to give me a lot of future wonderments in the world of poetry. But I really want to recommend Hog Lagoon, and it sounds like you have a manuscript in process. Is that true?
I do, yeah. I think Hog Lagoon is sold out. So yeah, I don't have anything to sell. Thank you so much for the recommendation though, and the careful read. Yeah, I think all the poems in Hog Lagoon are also in the current full-length manuscript, which is...
Does it have a name yet?
It does, yeah. It's called Manda Green.
Okay.
Which is like, Manda being, I don't say that word correctly probably, but the French for world. So like the green world, kind of picking up on, a lot of what we've been talking about, the greenness of the world, the greenness of capital, the sense of greenness as a kind of like naivete or certain kind of attention. And then a Manda Green, like one word, is itself a term for like a phrase that gets misheard and then kind of like takes on a life of its own.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's
yeah.
great. And do you have a sense of when it will emerge into the world?
I don't. No, I'm kind of in the process of, polishing it up and finishing edits and submitting it to a few poetry contests and hoping that I might connect with a publisher soon, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. It takes a while to get a book out into the world, so we'll see.
No, it's true. But I mean, I have to say, having now read a lot of your poems, I'm going to be very angry if this doesn't find a good home.
Well, thank you so much.
I want more to read, and I know the audience is going to want more to read. But luckily, you can find Sarah Jean Grimm's poems all over the internet, including at her own website, which I will link to, so that you can do some more reading across her work. And Sarah Jean, it was just such a pleasure to get to talk to you about your poems, which are so rich and linguistically full of pleasure and play, but also, carrying of serious weight in thinking about our moment in the world.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was a delight to get to talk to you, especially after years of emailing and working together on other authors' interviews. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Sarah Jean Grimm for coming on to talk about her chapbook, Hog Lagoon. You can find links to read poems from Hog Lagoon and many of Sarah Jean's other poetry at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.